Hello and welcome to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyoun Park from Amalgam Insights, joined as always by Charlie Araujo from the DX Institute. So this week, for a change, we've noticed that AI has not been as dominant in the enterprise IT world as usual. Um, I'm sure that will change next week. But over the past week, we actually noticed a couple of stories that are very interesting that, of course, are still related to AI, but are also very related to core IT challenges of the CIO that are going to make a difference. And we're going to start with a vendor-specific story around Oracle and Palantir joining forces. Two interesting companies. Obviously, one has been a dominant IT force for a long time, and Palantir has stayed the course, moving from startup to established tech company. So, Charlie, what did you think about these two companies? Definitely outliers in the IT world joining forces.
Well, I'm not sure if I can call Oracle an outlier, but certainly they've been playing catch up in the cloud space. I think this was interesting, sort of, insofar as what it continues to show is there's this realignment and there's this continued jostling for position. I think what was interesting is whether you believe it or not. I mean, this was the quote by Oracle, as in they're talking about this particular partnership, and it says Oracle is the only hyperscaler capable of delivering its entire AI and cloud suite to any business or government anywhere in the world. And this was Rand Waldman, one of the vice presidents at Oracle, talking about, let's see, we continued by combining the performance, scalability, and flexibility of Oracle Cloud infrastructure with Palantir's leading data and AI platforms. We will help our customers win in any industry environment. And what is interesting is they're obviously talking here about trying to focus on these very specific targeted use cases that have higher security requirements, or perhaps they need air gapped environments, those sorts of things, or maybe they need specific geolocations because of regulatory issues. And I think it shows that there's this ongoing evolution. I'm not sure I'm buying the statement that
Mhm.
it's truly the only that AWS or Google or Microsoft can't do this, but it does speak to sort of the focus that they're trying to cherry pick this space. And I think that speaks probably more to the relative challenge they've had in being competitive than anything else, but still noteworthy and still interesting.
Yes, this press release with Oracle and Palantir really looked like it was trying to have the best of both worlds. Of course, Oracle has for a long time been a trusted partner for governments. They've worked in the most sensitive uh, environments, including military and defense. One where Palantir has also worked, and I think they're trying to combine that message of being able to air gap the most sensitive workloads while also being able to provide support for large language models, generative AI, all the buzzwords that we talk about on a day-to-day basis. And I think that's part of where they are claiming that they can provide every cloud service in every type of environment, because they obviously work with many extremely sensitive environments that are very bespoke in nature. For instance, if you're working with something like the U.S. Army, they do not have standard uh, enterprise standards the way that your average company does.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a win for Oracle, and
Mhm.
and I think it's also be clear about something is, despite their competitive nature, they don't actually need to win
Good.
insofar as, right. I think what they need to get over the hump, and I think this is yet another sign that they're getting over this hump, is to be simply viable,
Mhm.
to not be a company when we're talking about cloud services that someone goes, oh no, why would you ever do that? That's, these are the big three, we only go with those three. And I've been hearing this certainly from CIOs that they have such an investment with Oracle that they have put Oracle Cloud on their short list. And let's remember the other thing is that I also haven't talked to very many CIOs. I won't say none, but very few CIOs recently that have a single cloud strategy, right? Everyone is multi-cloud, not in the way I think we used to talk about it, of this idea of workloads, rapidly traversing clouds and what have you, but they have different use cases and they are working with different cloud providers for those specific use cases. And I think this is a good step, like I said, a win for Oracle in particular, to say, hey, for these, heavily regulated or these specific use cases, that we're a very viable option, and that gives them a way to hang their hat on it. So, I don't think they need to win big to win, and I think this is an example of that.
Yes, Oracle continues to chip away and frankly, actually operate very wisely in its environment, trying to figure out how do we make ourselves a top 3 cloud? Where do we find the use cases and support companies in ways that Amazon, Microsoft, and Google have not successfully done to this point? They are picking and choosing very specific use cases and then tactically picking them off one by one to edge their way in, which is exactly what they should be doing and has made Oracle an actual player in the cloud infrastructure space in the way that 5 years ago we would not have said that Oracle was relevant.
I will also, one little comment before we move on, because I think we want to touch on some other security
Yes.
related aspects.
Mhm.
But one of the things I think it does point to is the rapid commoditization of the cloud space, where it is getting harder and harder. I mean, this probably wouldn't have been anything highly differentiated, a few years ago, meaning like that we would really hang your hat on. But because things are becoming so commoditized that it doesn't take, it's like any foothold you can get onto. And again, I think that actually that bodes well for Oracle, because again, they just have to be at that point of viability.
Mhm.
And I think there's the other aspect of it, and this has always been sort of Oracle's bread and butter, and that is that sticky factor, right? We love to talk about cloud services that they are, because they're so abstracted that you can just simply pick them up and move them. But that really isn't true. There is a huge sticky factor that if you can get somebody to get their workload onto your platform, onto your environment, there has to be a really strong reason to move it off. I mean, it is not as simple as it seems. And so, if they can pick up those wins and those use cases, um, then the odds are they're going to keep that business. And so I think it's a smart move for them. But I also think it speaks to the evolution of the kind of hierarchy here, where the game is going to get played above this level. So we'll see.
Yes, Oracle has always done a great job of providing necessary services to enterprise customers and then providing the value proposition to make you stay while raising the prices just enough to make you uncomfortable. But I think that's part of running a great business, quite frankly. Oracle has run a fantastic business over the years, and you don't have to worry about them going out of business because they will price their products and
That is
services accordingly. Appropriately to stay in business.
certainly one way of looking at it.
Yes.
So, did you want to cover? I know there were some other security related things. I know we're not security analysts per se, but it is every CIO I talk to, it's a top 5 concern. Even if they have a CISO, security is always a major concern. And there was some security news that I think you wanted to cover, right?
Oh gosh, there have been so many security stories that neither of us are dedicated security analysts, and we respect that is its own very specific world. But between the software supply chain issues that have been picked up, as well as some tactical hacks, we've seen AT&T dealing with just millions and millions of accounts that have been hacked with very poor explanations of what is happening there. We've seen some descriptions of last summer's Microsoft Exchange breaches and kind of what the Cybersecurity Review Board said as a result. Hint, hint, it is not very complimentary of Microsoft. And then also a recent hack where hundreds of thousands of social security numbers were stolen from a government consulting firm. Everything seems to be under attack, and we don't expect this to change anytime soon. Security is a huge challenge right now.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's I guess why I struggle with it. It's hard to even treat it as news because it's like there is no shock here. It is a tough world from a security standpoint. I think if you're a CIO, or CISO, I mean, any way you cut it, it's tough because if you're a small organization, then the good news is you maybe aren't a huge target, but the bad news is you have very few resources. And if you are a big organization, then you probably have a much higher level of resources being applied to it, but it also means you're a much bigger target. And the fact that we're seeing some of these from AT&T and Microsoft, and it just shows these companies with massive resources to put into it are still highly subject to this. And I don't have anything to say really. It's just like it's tough. You better be diligent. You better always be really focused. The one story that you alluded to that I really was fascinated by in like a watching a train wreck kind of perspective
Mhm.
is this news that came out about an obscure open source utility. In fact, I had to look it up. It's called the XZ Utils data compression tool, right? But it's one of these foundational libraries that is part of a huge number of very large open source distributions that are used everywhere. And one of the natures of the open source community is that you sort of once you kind of prove your bona fides, you're part of this team and you're producing, you're helping. And this particular case, this is a long haul, right? They apparently one or more people, they're not sure now, but posing as a single person, spent 2 years being a volunteer contributor to this and got enough trust in the thing where they planted this back door, and an engineer from Microsoft stumbled across it and just happened to find it because he was trying to find out why there was a 500 millisecond delay he wasn't expecting in some processing. I mean, thank God he was like really focused on this, but this could have been a massive backdoor breach. And it just speaks, again, the hard part for me is if I put on my CIO hat, I have nothing actionable here other than like, oh God, you just got to be really paying attention and focusing on everything, and you better keep your patches up because it's like it's nothing you can do on an individual basis, but it just speaks to how vulnerable our environments are that we sort of almost ignore, right? That this is something that probably every CIO has in their shop in some way, whether they knew it or not. And if the vulnerability was just astounding.
Yes, and at this point, everybody has open source dependencies in their IT organization. Yeah, there's no question about it. And this goes back. This is a topic that we've talked about to some extent in prior shows as well, where open source projects have many dependencies that are poorly managed and poorly monitored and poorly supported. It's a dirty secret, and the only solutions so far seem to either be to have large corporate and vendor resources assigned to a project, or frankly, moving the most vulnerable areas to closed source solutions, which have its own separate aspects of challenge.
And the hard part is even so much of the we talked about Redis a few weeks back,
Mhm.
right? Even closed source, or as we're moving increasingly to closed source type environments because of this, many of those are still rooted in open source, so they often are leveraging some of this, so which is makes this so nefarious. So it's I think that the big takeaway here is you need to have, if you're a CIO today, you need to have support. You need to be aware of it. You need to recognize the fact that not only is the security a top five concern, but you need to be aligning yourself with organizations. So I think we talked about this a few weeks back, right? When I would talk to CIOs were saying that they were sort of ambivalent, that it was all about the use case and the business problem they're trying to
Mhm.
solve. And I still think that's the core. But increasingly, if I'm a CIO today, I'm actually looking away from open source, or at least making sure I have a vendor. I don't want to be in the wild using open source. I think the vulnerabilities and the risks are just too high. So even if I'm going to use a core open source platform, I want to be purchasing it through somebody who's going to provide the support, who can react fast enough when something like this happens, because otherwise you're just at the mercy of someone catching something and being able to respond. So it is definitely, I think, ironically going, because we have to bring AI into this at some point, right? In this world, in the era of AI that we're in, where everything is now moving so fast and data is so critical, and these systems are now being put under this, I would argue, higher levels of stress because the use cases are becoming much more elaborate and intricate and complex.
Mhm.
That the vulnerability that your what's the term, the risk is a term in the security, I lost anyway, your risk profile isn't a better
Mhm.
term, um, is just widening, and so I think you need to be looking at how do you start minimizing that and managing against it.
Yes, and I think this also speaks to the challenges of being compliant with the U.S. federal government software bill of materials requirement. Really understanding how your software is constructed, the vulnerabilities that exist within your software, and being able to identify the challenges. So, for instance, the this XZ Utils issue, it was only found because one developer noticed that there was a 500 millisecond delay in performance compared to what was expected, and then dug into this issue to find the solution. That level of diligence is honestly not what is going into most applications and most projects. People are not pinging and performance testing every single aspect of all of these projects to that level.
Yeah, and by the way, we should give him credit. His name is Andre Freund. I think that's how says
Mhm.
his name. And interesting enough, because we just finished slamming Microsoft on the breach they had. He's a Microsoft engineer, but it just right, it just kind of goes to this. Yeah, so I think look at, I think it's tough. I think there's no great answer. I what I will say is that clearly security has continued to sort of move up the priority list and is ironically, I would say, because it is such a defensive thing, it's now a board level conversation that's happening, because it's all about risk. The challenge for me is that if you put, I come from the world of service management, and people used to talk about the risk associated with change. And I said it's really easy to eliminate all issues related to change. Stop making changes. The problem is you're going to strangle your organization and achieve absolutely nothing. And it's the same problem with security, is that you can continue to lock down, and you can get yourself to the point where you're completely rigid and you are not driving anything. And we're in an era where you need to be moving quickly. And so it's this balance that you have to continually strike, and it's going to really come down to the partnerships and who you're choosing from a vendor standpoint. And as we just with these reaches we talked about, there's no perfect. There's no. It's just about are they going to respond fast enough? And if I'm looking at CI today, I'm looking at not whether or not somebody was breached or whether they had an issue, because everyone's going to have an issue at some point.
Yes.
Is how they
Mhm.
respond. Were they transparent? Did they react? Did they do everything they could to mitigate it and to reduce your risk profile? Those are the things I'm looking at much more than, did they or didn't they?
Yeah, I feel like that is actually the most that visibility is more important at this point. And one of the challenges I see there is so, for instance, one of the other stories I mentioned was AT&T having 70 million accounts that were hacked, and their explanation as to why has been extremely vague. Obviously, nobody wants to talk about how they failed, but at the same time, when you have no idea what failed or what went wrong, it's a little hard to have ongoing trust in the vendor. And I feel to some extent, for better or for worse, a company like Microsoft, when it makes security mistakes, it will tell you what mistakes occurred. And then, sure, it's going to take the big hit. But you can move forward if you know what the problem is. And I feel to some extent we expect every major IT vendor to be a target for black hat hackers at this point. We don't expect anybody to be above the fray or be able to be 100% safe. Even the likes of Oracle, which has a pretty good record of being secure and governed, But I do think that one of the challenges here is trying to figure out, okay, if everybody is hackable, what is our backup plan for all of our data, all of our processes, so that we can move forward? We live in a world where we cannot expect any of our tech vendors to be 100% secure just because there are nation state actors literally that are trying to take down some of the biggest of the vendors out there.
So I guess the answer is your backup needs to be Oracle Cloud now because they're secure. Yeah, not, yeah, it is. I mean, what it's funny is I had I mentioned, I think here previously, I have this group that I call the DXIT Leadership Network, and it's a bunch of CIOs and CTOs, and we get together and we were talking about this, and there's the old school, old school practices, that are all related to disaster planning and recovery, and I would argue they've always been relevant. They're perhaps becoming more relevant now, when we start looking at this secondary kind of perspective of it. Because you've got to get there. You've got to be addressing all of those elements. Which also leads to, I think, the hand in hand that goes with this, and that is this idea of governance. And so I think we can't avoid talking about AI. There's always a little bit of AI, but security and governance sort of go hand in hand, because it's not just what we talked about. It's not just what you're doing, but governance is really the process, right? What are you doing on an ongoing basis to manage it? How are you responding in the event of issues? And so there's clearly the broad-based approach, and I would argue many organizations are still struggling with their governance approaches and policies, much for the same reason we talked about from a security standpoint, and that is you can use governance as a club and lock everything down, and all that means is you lose competitiveness because you can't be agile and adaptable. So you need to find that kind of balance point. What I think is interesting is that AI is introducing a whole new set. So there was some interesting, sort of almost sidebar news that came out from an IPO that sort of spoke to this. So I don't know if you want to bring that one up.
Yeah, the Rubrik IPO, obviously, tech IPOs are back, and Rubrik is definitely joining the crowd with filing its S1. And the fact that it's going IPO is not a big surprise. They've been a very successful startup, and been successful in the market. But they do have this AI governance committee that they talked about in their S1 filing, which is this cross-departmental group of individuals who are responsible for figuring out how AI will be used within their organization. And Rubrik, although they are a data-centric company, as for their offering, they are not technically an AI company. They would not consider themselves to be an AI provider in terms of their primary product. So it's interesting to see that they are looking at having this AI governance committee as a publicly stated capability. And it's an open question as to whether this is going to be a necessary capability going forward. It definitely seems to be something that people should be thinking about. And of course, everybody wants to say we have responsible AI, but actually having some guardrails there on what that means is an interesting perspective.
Yeah, I mean, so we talked about the U.S. government putting this mandate in that all of the government departments were going to, so talking about hiring 100 experts in AI. We talked about this last week, and effectively that's the same thing, right? These are people, individuals responsible versus committees. But it's a government. I'm sure they're going to have committees, So we talked about this last week that I think every organization should be following suit, but looking at it from both perspectives. And I would argue the same thing. I think governance is always tough because the initial posture is always that risk mitigation, and you could I think successfully make the argument that's its primary thing. I would argue, however, that governance is about the effective governing of a part of your strategy or if you're part of your tech stack, whatever it is that its scope is, to make it most effective. And part of that is reducing risk and managing risk, but part of it's also how are we most effectively leveraging this. So, I think it's certainly something that we're going to see every tech company do. And I think I would argue that you should see every, traditional enterprise do. And it's not a CIO shouldn't be an IT thing, but I do think the CIO is in a perfect position to sort of lead that charge and to get in front of it. And it's just a smart strategy. And I think what is interesting, another article that you raised up, is about the sort of ongoing struggle and the difference we're seeing right now between European regulators as they're trying to crack down on all of this, and U.S. companies who, the U.S. right now is definitely lagging on some of the regulations around AI. Is this in fact driving a disparity in competitiveness, particularly for those organizations that predominantly operate or are based in the EU? And I think it's a very fair question. I mean, it goes back to the same thing, striking that balance about protecting civil liberties and protecting privacy, and yet at the same time being able to move at a pace when this stuff is changing so fast, and that there's so much, more, frankly, more that we don't know than that we do know. And so, to me, I put all that under this big banner of governance, and I think it's going to be an area that's going to require a lot of focus. And I think where you can run the risk here, particularly if you're a CIO and you're trying to do this, is to kind of rubber stamp this or slap the traditional approaches to governance on this and say we're going to treat AI the same way. I think that's a surefire recipe that you're just going to bog yourself down and not be able to do anything. And I think you're going to need a much more adaptable approach to how you treat it.
Yeah, but we also AI is very challenging right now from a governance perspective because the geographically the standards are so different. Right now, the EU is going full steam ahead from a legislative perspective. They are happy to create new AI acts every few months to govern data, govern usage, govern how AI should be managed. And honestly, they've had a lot of practice in creating these government laws, going back to GDPR. Frankly, they are leading the way from a government-based governance perspective, whereas in the United States, for instance, it's no secret that we are pretty much a divided country from a legislative perspective, and it means it's very hard for us to pass any sort of law right now around AI that through our traditional means of creating a bill and then having it signed by the president and then going out to the rest of the world. So because we don't have those standards in the same way, the EU is kind of leading the way in terms of how AI should be managed, and everybody else is just kind of following that path for right now. It's very interesting because I think we would it's not that hard to argue that the EU has never been considered kind of startup friendly or concept friendly. And both the United States and China, I would say, are ahead in terms of creating AI based services because honestly, because both of these countries have fewer governance issues from an internal government perspective for actually developing AI, but now they're going to have to retrofit everything they're doing with EU standards to move forward. And by and as a result, all of us on the IT side are going to also have to retrofit what we are doing based on what the EU is doing, and potentially what all these other countries end up deciding at the end of the day. Because I don't think the United States will stay out of the AI governance lawmaking game forever.
No, I mean, this is, as you pointed out, this has been a long-standing challenge. The EU and the US are often at odds in terms of the level of regulation, and we live in a global economy now. And
Mhm.
so, any major company, it doesn't have to be that big, right? I would argue, your what I now call a small to medium enterprise, 300, $500 million in revenue, certainly not a global juggernaut, often operating in countless geographies around the world and having to deal with all of this. What worries me from an AI perspective is that I don't think people appreciate. I mean, on the one hand, I respect and appreciate the fact that, like, the EU regulators are trying to do a better job than they did with, say, social media, of getting
Mhm.
in front of this before this thing, before the train leaves the station. What I don't know that they're fully appreciating is not only how fast it's changing, but that the fundamentals of the technology that underpin this are changing. That that I think that by the time the ink is dry on half that stuff, it's going to be bordering on irrelevant, because of the nature. So I'm previewing something I'm definitely going to want to talk about next week. I just read this article about, effectively why we may already be running out of steam on LLMs,
Hmm.
and what that sort of means to the enterprise or to the world. But underlying that means that all these rules we're focused on are all focused on the way LLMs work, and we're almost certainly going to be transitioning this technology relatively quickly, I think. And so, I think I think regulation is going to be such a slippery slope. And I think if I'm the EU, I think you do need to be concerned about, yes, being ahead of it's great, but if you make the organization trying to, from the EU, trying make them less competitive because of it, then I'm not sure that's really, beneficial to you either. So, right now they're mostly targeting the big companies, the big tech. That's pretty safe ground, I think, because they've got the
Hmm.
wherewithal to try to nuance it. But we'll see where that plays out. But speaking of big tech, I really want to talk, the one I'm really really fascinated by, this news. I'm not even sure we call it news, rumor maybe, that Google, the Alphabet, I guess, is making noise about acquiring HubSpot, right? A major CRM player
Yes.
who has
Hmm.
been really sort of taking it to Salesforce a little bit recently. And I read this and was sort of scratching my head. So I know you follow the space, um, to a degree, and so I'm really curious your take on this, whatever it is.
Yeah, I'm super interested in seeing what ends up happening because when we look at, let's call them the four big cloud companies that are North America based, and both Microsoft and Oracle already have pretty mighty application suites. Amazon has been uh, not really made much hay in the app space and has really stuck to being a platform and infrastructure player from a practical perspective. Of course, they would disagree, but when I look at what they're doing across analytics and standard enterprise applications, I don't think of Amazon much at all, quite frankly. Um, and then you've got Google, which is right in the middle. They've got their Google Suite. They've got their investments in things like Looker for business intelligence, and they have bits and pieces that matter. They obviously matter a lot in marketing analytics, as the dominant search engine and search application platform, but they've never quite made it fully into the enterprise application world, despite having all the infrastructure and all the platforms. So the idea that they are trying to fix this gap by going to HubSpot is very interesting. On the one hand, HubSpot has obviously been a fast growing startup for such a long time and always seem to have the answer for how to take that next step. They've been very smart in that regard, as they've started as marketing automation and added CRM, and then really went up market as well, to the point where they are a trusted small and medium business solution where you can start freemium, but also there are plenty of companies out there that now have hundreds and hundreds of seats of HubSpot in their organization. So they've done a fantastic job there. But I wonder if the fit is actually there, right?
That's the part that left me scratching my head from a cultural fit standpoint. They seem almost antithetical to one another, and so that made me really sort of question. I also question just overall. I mean, I appreciate your perspective that Microsoft has their whole angle, um, and that Google already has the productivity suite and some of the other parts. But I've always looked at, well, really, even if I throw this into the mix, I mean, I've always looked at Google and AWS as core platforms. And
Hmm.
if you look at Microsoft is such a huge company, I really put Azure in that exact same category. Yeah, sure, you have all the Microsoft Office stuff, and maybe it's all blending together. That's why you're causing me to rethink some of my attitude here. But I know there was rumors a couple of years ago about AWS going into the application space, and the consensus then also seemed to be like, that's not the right alignment. It's like you got the platforms, you got the application layers, it's on top, And the only one that's really going there, that in my opinion is Oracle, but they kind of went into it backwards, right? They were at the application layer. Now they're trying to build this core, cloud platform. Um, and so I sit here and I'm scratching my head around it, that and to your point, right? HubSpot maybe is a better fit in insofar as their historical landing was more of the small, medium size player, and they started with marketing automation. But I look at them now, and that they're absolutely taking market share from Salesforce. They're absolutely playing in the major enterprise. They've definitely sort of elevated all of that. And I'm struggling to see, if I look at where Google Cloud should be trying to compete, this isn't where I'd go. Right? This isn't where I would go. Oh, this is what you're missing. This is the part that's going to really set you apart with it. So, I'm a huge fan of HubSpot. So, anyone who gets them, feather in their cap, I think that's a good thing. My concern is that I mean, there's some exception to Google making good acquisitions and not killing the brands, but for the most part, I'd just be really concerned that this would not be a good thing for HubSpot customers.
Yeah, when I think of Google successfully buying companies and turning them into revenue, I think of companies like DoubleClick and YouTube, where basically it was almost like embed it into the business and then set it and forget it. But I feel like that's not really HubSpot's model. HubSpot has traditionally been a company that has really educated its customers, done a lot of work into inbound marketing, and really established itself and aggressively gone after sales in a way that I'm not sure that Google understands. Google's approach is always put out 1,000 products and hope that a couple of them stick to the wall. And if one of them happens to get 1 billion customers, that's great. We will push all our chips into that and kind of ignore everything else and kill it off. That's definitely not how HubSpot has treated things over time. Although HubSpot is experimental in what it does, they have a much more structured way of going after business that I'm not sure works with how Google chooses to do things.
Yeah, I mean, now on the flip side, I think Google Cloud has struggled. I mean, and actually, I mean, we keep talking about Google Cloud, but Alphabet is where this acquisition rumor is coming from.
Right.
So that also leads the open question: is this going to be a whole standalone thing? But if it is part of, we'll call it their enterprise business play. Maybe HubSpot becomes the tail that wags the dog, and actually does help them reorient, because I think they've really struggled. Um, in many ways, to find sort of that competitive footing. Given the fight they have on their hands around the AI side, I do wonder if they can, keep this many balls in the air if they do go down this road.
Mhm.
But what I do think here, so those are all a lot of what ifs specific to this transaction. I do think it is signaling, though, of something else we've talked about, and that is this continual movement that I think we're seeing to larger plays, that
Mhm.
the independent provider of a technology, the startup sort of ethos, I think, is continuing to struggle as enterprises are looking to these big platforms to do more and to invest in these platforms, because they can consolidate their spend, get one throat to choke, so to speak, and just find a more competitive posture, because with the idea being these big companies can innovate faster because they have the resources with all this stuff that's moving. And I mean, I was looking at the ServiceNow website yesterday, and looking at their A to Z product list, and it's staggering the number of products, right? From a company that a decade ago had one, basically, right? They had IT service management, and now I think it's 100 different products, and some of them, maybe aren't true products in the greatest sense, but nevertheless, it's like this huge swath, and we're seeing the same thing with Salesforce and all their acquisitions and all their major product groups, and so you're seeing this evolution. And so, from that regard, at the kind of macro level, this doesn't surprise me. This doesn't surprise me that a player that has momentum, that has traction, that is well regarded in the market, is a desirable acquisition target for a larger player that is trying to fill out a suite and try to compete more with, hey, we can come and take care of all of your needs, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's indicative of that, and I think we're going to see more of it.
And I think that combination of hardware and software, and being able to move quickly is important. ServiceNow, although they're obviously best known as a software company, ITSM, service management, asset management, and then general service capabilities. ServiceNow has its own cloud. ServiceNow is on a single platform for all of its applications, which I still like. I'm in awe every time I think about that. With the spaghetti platforms that are out there, the ability for ServiceNow to stay consistent on a single platform and to spend years sometimes to rewrite new applications from acquisitions to fit onto that platform. That takes a lot of dedication and focus that honestly most platforms, even large multi-billion-dollar platforms, just lack the ability to do. And I think the ability for, say, ServiceNow or Zoho, which we've talked about in the past, their abilities to have that consistent platform infrastructure and applications, and to be able to move at the speed of the business and to continue expanding offerings is very attractive. And when you look at that, it's not as surprising to see why Google would want to have an application play to be able to match that speed and level of partnership that is increasingly necessary in the business world.
Yeah, although you just nailed, I think, the challenge they have. If I look at, you went exactly where I went, right? I think ServiceNow has shown a tremendous commitment to that. Zoho has shown a commitment, their willingness to not take money so that they could build everything and build that common data platform. And I would argue even AWS, right? AWS is stuck to their guns about, and it's not an application layer, but this idea of a unified platform that everything sort of runs on and hangs on neatly. I
Everything's
think
an API. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Google has struggled with that, and particularly with some of these acquisitions. And the fact that this is Alphabet, a holding company, that the rumors are that this we're buying it, would lead me to think that maybe that isn't where they're going. And I'm not sure what that would mean. So I do think it's an interesting time that we're seeing all this play out. I do think there's one other element that this sort of is signaling that we should not ignore, and that is that at the end of the day, if I look at HubSpot's evolution from marketing automation to CRM, really what they've been focused on are the sales and marketing workflows, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if I look at ServiceNow, I've been spending some time on going through a lot of their materials recently, and they are very, very much today focused on the work of the business, right? The business workflows and these
Right.
business processes. And there's been interesting data that it's not just, so certainly ServiceNow has been reporting some really strong financials, but so has people like Pegasystems and Appian, others that are focusing in this sort of core business process automation. And what's interesting about all these companies, they're all 20 plus years old, right? This is an area of focus for a very long time that I think in the era of AI has sort of found newfound relevance, because we're recognizing I can't apply AI to anything if I don't have two things: if I don't have the data, and if I don't have a process that I
Mm-hmm.
can automate against, right? And so this level, and we were talking about Celonis the last week, right? And some of the stuff they've been doing with helping with supply chain and applying AI, same thing. It's all process centric. And so I do think that that makes someone like a HubSpot attractive, because they're so keyed into this very, very specific, in their case, specific set of business processes, but they are these core business processes. And so, as opposed to the rest of, say, most of Google's businesses, at least on the enterprise side, which are just the foundational platform services, right? And so, I think that is another element of it that I think is very interesting to watch. And again, if I'm a CIO today, I'm saying, how do I really focus on automation, my core business processes? How do I apply that? How do I get my blocking and tackling done to really be ready to move forward?
Yeah, it's been fascinating to see the shift that 10, 15 years ago, we would all say it's all about the data. It's all about Moneyball. It's all about analytics. It's all about business intelligence. And we all rushed to that. And yes, it was an important piece of the puzzle, but I think we're starting to realize that process and the actual outputs of work matter a lot as well. In fact, may matter even more. And these companies that we bring up, whether it be the Appians and Pegasystems of the world, or other robotic process automation companies like UiPath Automation Anywhere, or service companies, such service management companies such as ServiceNow. These all have huge portfolios and of processes that can now be used to map to both on the one hand to data and analytics, and the other hand to all of these new interesting AI capabilities that come into place. Because at the end of the day, AI is super smart, but has to actually do something, has to actually dig back into a process to be useful at the end of the day. That mapping has not been fully figured out yet, but to actually make that work, we're going to have to go back to all of these process companies to really figure out how to make that happen.
Well, and I think it's exactly what you're saying. It's not either or. And I think what is going to make this an incredibly exciting time is it's the intersection of all of this coming
Mhm.
together. It's not analytics is the answer or process is the answer. It's that when all of it comes together, because as humans, that's what we need, right? We need all of it to come together to be able to make a
Mhm.
decision. And so I'll preview some of what I know I'm going to want to talk about next week. I mentioned this article about where the challenge with LLMs, and the other big topic that is coming up recently is this idea of agentic AI, right? Which start to
Mhm.
address some of that. And so I think that will be an interesting conversation. We're going to be back to AI next week. What
Oh
it is what
yeah.
it is. But I think it's really interesting stuff. I think it's both challenging and a great opportunity. It's a great time. It's amazing to see it all come together.
Yeah. So sorry for spending so much time on security and process and the things that we actually care about in the IT world. But don't worry. Next week, I'm sure we will be back to the flood of AI stories that have been overwhelming us over the past weeks. And with that, I think that's a wrap. It's been great to chat with you, as always, Charlie. There's so many challenges for us working with CIOs, working with CIO office challenges, and trying to figure out just how to make all these new news stories make sense in the world that we're in. But with that, thanks so much for joining us. As always, if you're checking this out, please like, please subscribe. Please let us know in the comments or email us about any topics you think we should be covering for next week. Thanks a lot and have a great day.